Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I am making bread from scratch and kneading it by hand. Typically I prefer using the KitchenAid stand mixer, but every so often it is good to do things the old-fashioned way to stay in practice. In this video I am making 2 loaves of bread, but will include the recipe and measurements for both 1 loaf and 2 loaves of bread in the description box. These ingredients are not set in stone. They are actually very customizable. If you do not like the amount of salt or sugar that I am using, then reduce or increase to your liking. I am using whole wheat flour, so the bread will be darker and denser than if I were using bread flour or all-purpose flour. If you do not currently eat or like whole wheat, I recommend you use all-purpose flour instead of whole wheat flour. I start with 3 cups of warm water. Remember, this is for 2 loaves of bread. If you want to make the 1 loaf, check the description box for those measurements. To that, I add 1½ tablespoons of yeast. I then add 1 tablespoon of sugar. The yeast will react to the sugar, which we will see when we come back to it. I give it a little stir and set it aside. Next, I add 6½ cups of whole wheat flour to the bowl. However, I recommend you use all-purpose flour if you currently do not eat whole wheat bread, or if you typically buy white bread from the store. One tablespoon of salt was added to the flour, then mixed to incorporate the dry ingredients. This is how the yeast looks after sitting for a few minutes. The foam on top lets you know it's alive and activated. Now I measure out 1/4 cup of oil. In this case I'm using olive oil, but you can use whatever cooking oil you prefer. Now is the fun and messy part. The water yeast mixture and the oil are poured into the bowl of flour. To start, I mix the wet ingredients using a wooden spoon. Once most of the wet and dry ingredients are incorporated, I move to kneading the dough with my hands. Most people prefer to knead on a flat surface, but for some reason I prefer to knead in a bowl. Expect to knead the dough for 5 to 10 minutes. And this is when a stand mixer really comes in handy. When kneading the dough, if you find that it's too dry, add a little water. If you find that it's too wet, add a little flour. But you want to knead the dough until it gets to a consistency where it's not really sticky. After kneading the dough and it gets to the consistency that you like, place it in a greased bowl to rest a few hours, allowing it to rise. You can use the same bowl, but it felt like this was too small. The bowl I normally use was being used for something else. So instead I used the stand mixer bowl. Cover the bowl with a lid, plastic, or towel. The time it takes for the dough to rise will depend on the temperature in your house. Once the dough has risen, it is now time to punch it down, form it, and let it rise again before placing in the oven. Since this is enough dough to make 2 loaves of bread, I am cutting it in half. I could have taken the first half and placed it in the bread pan, allowed it to rise, and then put it in the oven. Instead, here I am flattening the dough with my hands. I could use a roller pin to get it more symmetrical, but this way we'll have more of a homemade look to it. Then I roll the dough tightly and pinch the seam so that it doesn't come undone. Now I lightly grease the bread pan, place the dough in the pan, and allow it to rise again. Be sure and cover the pan on the second rise to ensure the dough doesn't dry out. This is the second loaf. However, I am not going to bake it just yet. This loaf will sit in the refrigerator for 2 to 4 days to allow it to ferment much more. Allowing the dough to ferment really enhances the flavor of the bread. We always try to plan ahead when making breads, pizza, or other things to allow the dough at least 1 to 3 days of fermenting. After allowing the dough to rise the second time, I placed it in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 35 to 40 minutes. I removed the bread from the pan and placed it on a cooling rack. You should wait until the bread is completely cooled before placing it in a storage bag or container. And there you have it. Now I can make sandwiches for lunch. Also, feel free to slice the bread and store in the freezer what you do not use. This bread recipe calls for 6 ingredients: flour, salt, yeast, water, and oil. But you can find most of these ingredients in many people's kitchen. If you do not typically bake, the only ingredient that would likely be missing from your pantry is the yeast. But you can find this in just about any store. Having flour, water, oil, salt, and sugar on hand, as well as yeast, makes it possible to produce various dough-based dishes. Here's a side-by-side view of half of the dough that was cooked the same day after the second rise, and the other half that fermented in a refrigerator for 5 days before being baked. I hope that you have enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe to help this small channel to grow.